Churchill didn't make safe decisions. He made dangerous ones. And the closer you look, the more you realize how many of them almost went catastrophically wrong. These are the most dangerous decisions he made in World War II. Number 1. The refusal. Churchill's critical decision to reject peace with Hitler in May 1940. The date was May 28, 1940. Not a date you'll find on most war memorials. No battle was fought that day. No bombs fell on London. But inside a small room in Westminster, an argument was happening that was more consequential than almost any engagement on any battlefield during the entire war. Winston Churchill had been Prime Minister for fewer than 3 weeks. And he was already being asked, by members of his own cabinet, to consider opening negotiations with Adolf Hitler. The man pushing hardest for talks was Lord Halifax, Britain's Foreign Secretary, a serious man, a respected man, a man who genuinely believed he was trying to save his country. His argument wasn't irrational. France was days away from total collapse. The British Expeditionary Force was surrounded at Dunkirk with no guaranteed escape route. The Royal Air Force was bleeding. And Hitler, at that precise moment, was willing to let Britain keep its empire if Churchill simply agreed to acknowledge German dominance over continental Europe. Halifax looked at that offer and saw a lifeboat. Churchill looked at it and saw a trap. What made this decision so dangerous wasn't just the geopolitical stakes, it was the internal pressure. This wasn't Hitler making demands from across the channel. This was Churchill's own government fracturing beneath him. Neville Chamberlain, the former Prime Minister sitting right there in the War Cabinet, was leaning toward Halifax. 2 of the 5 most powerful men in Britain were telling Churchill that negotiation was not surrender, it was survival. And for approximately 3 days, the outcome of that debate was genuinely uncertain. Churchill's refusal wasn't immediate, and it wasn't simple. He maneuvered. He stalled Halifax with procedural delays while simultaneously working to consolidate support from the outer cabinet, the broader circle of ministers who weren't in the room for those closed-door sessions. On May 28, he called them together and spoke without notes, without a prepared text, with a directness that people who were there would describe for the rest of their lives. He told them that if Britain went down, it would go down fighting. That no terms Hitler offered could be trusted. That a nation which negotiated from a position of military collapse would not be negotiating, it would be surrendering on an installment plan. The room erupted. Ministers who had been wavering came to him, grabbed his hands, slapped him on the back. The moment turned. But here's what history tends to gloss over: Churchill didn't know Dunkirk was going to work. When he made that speech, when he closed the door on negotiations, the evacuation hadn't happened yet. He was making the most consequential decision of the war based on will, on instinct, and on a calculated read of Hitler's character, not on guaranteed military outcomes. If the evacuation had failed, if the army had been captured or destroyed on those beaches, Churchill's refusal to negotiate would have looked like the act of a reckless man who threw away Britain's last chance at a reasonable exit. History is written by survivors. And Churchill survived, but only barely, and only because the weather cooperated. The Royal Navy improvised brilliantly, and Hitler made his own strange decisions about when to advance. The lesson buried inside this moment isn't simply that Churchill was brave. Plenty of brave men have led nations into ruin. The lesson is that Churchill understood something Halifax didn't, that negotiating with Hitler was not a path to peace, it was a path to a slower, more humiliating version of defeat. He had read Mein Kampf. He had watched what happened to every country that trusted Hitler's guarantees. And he made a bet, a dangerous, unilateral, potentially catastrophic bet, that fighting was the only option that left Britain with any real future. He was right. But in those 3 days in May 1940, being right was not yet obvious to anyone in that room except him. Number 2, the soft underbelly, delaying D-Day to strangle the Axis through the Mediterranean. There's a strategic debate from World War II that military historians still argue about in classrooms and journals today, and most people outside academic circles have never heard of it. It's the question of whether Churchill's insistence on fighting through North Africa, Sicily, and Italy before launching the main invasion of France was a stroke of Mediterranean genius or a catastrophically expensive detour that prolonged the war by at least a year. The Americans thought it was the latter. Churchill pushed it anyway. And the consequences of that decision, in lives, in time, and in the shape of the post-war world, were enormous. Churchill called it the soft underbelly of Europe. The idea was elegant on paper. Rather than launching a massive, high-risk frontal assault across the English Channel into the most heavily fortified coastline the Germans could construct, the Allies would instead press into southern Europe, North Africa first, then Sicily, then Italy, forcing Hitler to spread his forces, weakening the Axis from below, and potentially knocking Italy out of the war entirely before the big push began. It sounded like strategy. To the American military establishment, led by generals like George Marshall and Dwight Eisenhower, it sounded like delay dressed up in sophisticated language. The Americans wanted a cross-channel invasion in 1942. Churchill said no. They pushed again for 1943. Churchill maneuvered, negotiated, and ultimately persuaded Roosevelt to commit to North Africa instead, Operation Torch, while the main invasion of France was pushed back. What followed was a grinding, brutal, and often forgotten campaign up the Italian peninsula that consumed Allied resources for nearly 2 years, cost hundreds of thousands of casualties, and ended with Allied forces still fighting in northern Italy when the war in Europe officially ended in May 1945. The soft underbelly turned out to have a spine made of concrete and German engineering. If you found value in this kind of deep historical analysis, the decisions behind the decisions, the debates that shaped the war, consider subscribing. There's a lot more coming, and you won't want to miss what's ahead in this video. The strategic cost of the Mediterranean detour is still being calculated. Some historians argue Churchill was right, that the Allies in 1942 and early 1943 were not yet ready for a cross-channel assault, that the logistics weren't there, that the disaster at Dieppe in August 1942 proved exactly how catastrophic a premature invasion could have been. Others argue that the Italian campaign became a strategic dead end, that it tied up Allied divisions that could have been driving into Germany far earlier, and that Churchill's Mediterranean obsession had as much to do with protecting British imperial interests in the region as it did with sound military strategy. Both arguments have merit. Neither fully wins. What makes this decision genuinely dangerous, beyond the military calculus, is what it meant for the post-war map of Europe. Every month the Western Allies spent fighting their way up Italy was another month the Soviet Red Army was advancing westward. By the time D-Day finally happened in June 1944, the Soviets had already turned the tide at Stalingrad, had smashed the Germans at Kursk, and were pushing deep into Eastern Europe. The Iron Curtain that would divide Europe for the next 4 decades was being drawn, in part, by the pace of Western Allied advance, a pace shaped significantly by Churchill's Mediterranean strategy. The countries that fell under Soviet control before Western forces could reach them stayed under Soviet control for generations. Churchill saw this danger clearly by 1944 and would try to address it through other means, which is a story for later in this video. The deepest irony of the soft underbelly strategy is that Churchill, the man who understood better than almost anyone what Soviet domination of Eastern Europe would mean, was also the man whose strategic choices helped create the conditions for it. He delayed the Western Front to avoid catastrophic casualties in France. He succeeded. D-Day, when it finally came, was horrific enough even with years of preparation. But the delay had a price, and that price was paid not in British or American blood, but in the freedom of millions of people in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania who would spend the next 50 years behind a wall that was, in part, built from the architecture of Churchill's own decisions. Number 3. The unlikely alliance, the decision to support the Soviet Union after the German invasion. On June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory along a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles. And within hours of receiving the news, Winston Churchill, a man who had spent the better part of 2 decades describing communism as a civilizational disease, who had supported military intervention against the Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War, who had called Lenin a plague bacillus carried into Russia in a sealed train, that same man went on BBC radio and announced that Britain would give every possible assistance to the Soviet Union. No hesitation. No conditions. No ideological qualifications. The decision was immediate, total, and, to many people who knew Churchill's history, absolutely stunning. Churchill himself anticipated the reaction. The night before his broadcast, an aide reminded him of his long record of anti-communist statements and asked how he could possibly reconcile supporting Stalin with everything he had said and written. Churchill's response has become one of the most quoted lines of the entire war: "If Hitler invaded hell, I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." It was vintage Churchill, witty, disarming, and underneath the humor, completely serious. He had made a cold strategic calculation, and he had made it fast. The Soviet Union represented hundreds of divisions, thousands of tanks, and an almost incomprehensible reserve of manpower. If Hitler destroyed it, the entire Eastern Front collapsed, and Germany could turn its full industrial and military weight westward. Britain could not survive that. Supporting Stalin wasn't idealism. It was arithmetic. But the arithmetic came with a moral cost that Churchill never fully resolved and rarely discussed in public. Joseph Stalin, in the summer of 1941, was not simply an authoritarian leader with policies Churchill disliked. He was the architect of the Great Terror, a man personally responsible for the deaths of millions of his own citizens through forced collectivization, deliberate famine, and systematic political murder. The Gulag was operating at full capacity. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, had recently massacred thousands of Polish officers in the Katyn forest, an act of calculated extermination that the Soviet Union would deny for 50 years. Churchill knew enough about Stalin's record to understand exactly who he was choosing as an ally. He made the choice anyway, and he defended it with the kind of ruthless moral clarity that only total war seems to produce. What followed was one of the most complicated and tension-filled alliances in modern military history. Churchill sent convoys, the famous Arctic convoys, through some of the most dangerous waters in the world, running supplies to Soviet ports under constant attack from German submarines and aircraft. Hundreds of Allied sailors died making those runs. The material support was massive: tanks, aircraft, food, raw materials, ammunition, all shipped at enormous cost and risk to keep the Soviet war machine fighting. And Stalin, for his part, received it all, demanded more, complained constantly that it wasn't enough, and pressed Churchill relentlessly to open a second front in Western Europe, the very second front Churchill was strategically delaying with his Mediterranean campaign. The irony was thick enough to cut. The personal dynamic between Churchill and Stalin was one of the strangest relationships of the entire war. They met face to face in Moscow in August 1942, and Churchill had to deliver the news that there would be no cross-channel invasion that year. Stalin's response was brutal. He accused Churchill of cowardice, of letting the Russians die while the British held back. Churchill erupted. The meeting nearly collapsed entirely. And yet, by the end of that same evening, the two men were drinking together and trading stories in Stalin's private apartments until 4 in the morning. There was something between them that transcended ideology, a mutual recognition of force, of ruthlessness, of the kind of will that political survival in the most extreme circumstances produces. They never fully trusted each other. They never stopped needing each other. The long-term danger of this alliance wasn't military, it was political. Every weapon Britain and America shipped to the Soviet Union, every convoy that made it through, every month the Eastern Front held and the Red Army grew stronger, was also building the post-war power of a regime that Churchill himself believed posed a profound threat to European freedom. He was simultaneously fighting to defeat one totalitarian empire and empowering another. The decision to support Stalin was the right call in 1941. There is almost no serious historian who argues otherwise. But right calls in wartime carry consequences that extend far beyond the war itself, and Churchill was one of the few leaders who understood this clearly enough to feel the full weight of the contradiction he was living inside. By the time the war ended, Churchill had already begun to see the shape of what was coming. The alliance that had saved civilization from Nazi domination was fracturing in real time, and the map of Europe was being redrawn in ways that would haunt the continent for generations. In a private conversation in 1944, Churchill reportedly told his doctor that he feared they had slaughtered the wrong pig. It was a characteristically brutal way of articulating something that kept him awake at night, the possibility that in defeating Hitler with Stalin's help, they had guaranteed the rise of a different kind of darkness. The decision to support the Soviet Union was necessary. It was dangerous. And its consequences are still unfolding in ways that would not have surprised Churchill at all. If this video made you see Churchill differently, hit that like button right now. It helps this channel reach more people who love history. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. And click the video on your screen right now. It's another incredible story from World War II that most people have never heard.